Welcome to The Explainer. I'm really thrilled to have you here today because, well, we're unpacking one of the absolutely most powerful and definitely most heavily debated forces in the modern world, and that's fiscal policy. Imagine the global economy is just this massive, intricate engine. Sometimes it sputters, sometimes it runs way too hot. When that happens, the government basically has to step in, put on its mechanics overalls, and pop open its toolkit to get things running smoothly again. But how exactly do they do that? And what tools are they actually using?
It brings up a really provocative question, doesn't it? One that economists and politicians have argued about for literal decades. Can the government simply spend its way to a perfect economy? Like, can it just write checks to fix every slowdown and tax its way out of every inflation spike? Okay, let's dive into this because the reality of how these tools work is far more intricate than most people realize.
So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to open up that economic toolkit. First, the goals of fiscal policy. Second, deficits versus national debt. Third, the fiscal policy toolkit itself. Fourth, the fiscal multiplier. And finally, number 5, the challenges of implementation. Let's just get right into it.
Section 1. Goals of fiscal policy. Steering the economy.
Ultimately, what is the government trying to achieve here before they start pulling levers? Well, they want to create an environment with stable, positive economic growth alongside stable, low inflation. They're trying to steer aggregate output and demand through active spending and taxation. And, when necessary, they use these tools to redistribute income and wealth among the population. Now, unlike monetary policy, which is all about central banks managing the money supply, fiscal policy is about the government directly putting its hands on the levers of output and demand to avoid those really dangerous economic booms and busts. Section 2. Deficits versus national debt, the long-term cost. You hear these two terms thrown around constantly, right? And people often use them interchangeably, but they are actually very different. A deficit is a strictly annual event. It's just the yearly shortfall that happens when a government spends more than it brings in through taxes over a single fiscal year. The national debt, on the other hand, well, that's the grand total. It is the historical accumulation of all those yearly deficits just stacked on top of one another over time. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what we're talking about. Notice how the UK national debt as a percentage of GDP violently spikes throughout history. Those massive mountains of debt you're seeing, they correlate directly with financing major conflicts. Specifically, we're looking at the Napoleonic Wars in the 1800s and, of course, the First and Second World Wars in the 20th century. During crises like these, massive annual deficits dramatically inflate the total national debt. So it's crisis response, not normal everyday economic cycles, that really drives these historic surges. Now, you might be wondering, does this giant mountain of debt actually matter for the day-to-day economy? There's this absolutely fascinating economic theory called Ricardian equivalence, named after David Ricardo. Think of it kind of like your own household budget. If your family sees the government running a massive deficit today, you know that eventually they're going to have to raise taxes to pay that money back, right? So according to this theory, instead of taking any extra money and spending it to boost the economy, the private sector is simply going to hoard their cash today in anticipation of tomorrow's tax bill. If that's true, it means government borrowing might perfectly offset private spending, basically neutralizing the whole economic boost. Wild, right? Section 3. The Fiscal Policy Toolkit. Levers of the economy. Let's actually pop open that toolkit now. Looking at the revenue side, taxation, take a look at the split for the UK government. You've got direct taxes, like that massive slice for income tax, which are levied directly on individuals and corporations. Meanwhile, indirect taxes, like value-added tax or excise duties, hit goods. Think things like alcohol and fuel. By tweaking these specific levers, the government can quickly cool down consumer spending or, conversely, give citizens more take-home pay to stimulate growth. On the flip side of the toolkit, we have the spending levers. And the absolutely crucial thing to grasp here is that they operate at very different speeds. You have transfer payments, stuff like welfare, unemployment benefits, and pensions. Now, these don't create new economic output directly, but they instantly redistribute wealth and provide a basic income floor. Then you have current spending, which is basically keeping the lights on, paying doctors and teachers. But then there's capital expenditures, building new roads, hospitals, things like that. These are the heavy machinery of the toolkit. They build long-term economic capacity for sure, but they take years to plan, approve, and actually implement compared to the instant nature of a transfer payment.
Section 4. The Fiscal Multiplier, Amplifying Policy.
This brings us to a mathematical power-up for the government, the fiscal multiplier. And this entire concept rests on one key metric, the marginal propensity to consume, or MPC. Just imagine getting a surprise extra dollar in your pocket today.
The MPC is simply the percentage of that dollar you take to the store to spend versus what you drop into your piggy bank to save. When people are feeling really confident about the economy, their MPC is high. They spend more, and here's the magic. Their spending immediately becomes someone else's income. So the crucial point is how this cascades through the economy. Let's look at the math from our source material. Imagine a scenario where the tax rate is 20% and people's marginal propensity to consume is 90%. Because of this geometric ripple effect, where my spending becomes your income, and then you spend 90% of that, which becomes someone else's income, and so on, a $1 billion investment by the government organically grows into $3.57 billion of actual total income and spending in the real economy. That is the fiscal multiplier in action. It dramatically amplifies the government's initial move. Section 5. The challenges of implementation, a messy reality. Okay, I know, that all sounds absolutely amazing in theory, right? Just calculate the multiplier, inject the exact right amount of money, and boom, perfectly balance the economy. But executing fiscal policy in the real world is often compared to driving while looking in the rearview mirror. Why? Because policymakers do not have a magical dashboard showing the economy in real time. By the time they actually get GDP or inflation data, it's already months old, and it's constantly being revised. They're basically forced to make decisions for the future based on a very blurry picture of the past. And this creates a chronological nightmare of delays, which economists call lags. Let's walk through them. First, there's the recognition lag. It literally takes months just to officially realize the economy has entered a recession. Once they finally know, they hit the action lag. Politicians have to debate, draft, and pass policy, which, as we all know, can take many more months of gridlock. Finally, there's the impact lag. Remember those capital expenditures we talked about earlier, like building roads? Even after a bill is passed, it takes a massive amount of time for the money to leave the Treasury, get into the hands of construction workers, and actually ripple through the economy. By the time the fix actually kicks in, the underlying economic problem might have already changed entirely. Which leaves us with a truly vital question to ponder as we wrap up. We've seen the government's toolkit. We understand how they try to steer aggregate demand, the mathematical hope of the fiscal multiplier, and of course, the terrifying reality of decision-making lags and expanding national debt. So given that the government is essentially steering a massive ship with delayed steering and an outdated math, and considering the risk of burdening future generations with debt, are these stabilization efforts truly worth the risk? Or does the intervention sometimes cause more turbulence than it actually prevents? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking these tough questions, and I'll see you next time.